hopefully you get a delicacy because there's
Hopefully,
far too
yes.
many times when this book
Yeah.
has been turned into
Oh my
something
gosh.
deadly for far
Yes.
too many people. We're skipping Joshua, we're skipping Judges. They're great books, but here we are at the book of Ruth. The narrative lectionary for October 15th takes us to the first 17 verses of chapter 1 of Ruth. Adriene, you are back in the pulpit, and not only is this Ruth, but it's also Children's Sabbath. So maybe let's start there. What is Children's Sabbath, and why is that important?
Children's Sabbath comes from our partners at the Children's Defense Fund. I understand it as an opportunity for the church to center the voices and the needs of children. And we also, I think, at Riverside, take it as an opportunity to center children's needs in worship. What does it mean for children to Sabbath? What does it mean for them to rest? But also, what does it mean for children and youth to have leadership? Not only in worship, but in the church writ large. So we've been asking those questions and wrestling with them, I think, before I arrived at Riverside, certainly, but definitely since I got back from the Haley Farm this summer, experiencing the Children's Defense Fund Freedom School.
So it's always a fantastic, annual kind of event, but the best, thing we can learn from it is that you don't just focus on kids one Sunday out of the year, but it's a reminder of what we need to be doing. And like what you said, what we have been kind of leaning our focus towards. So that's this Sunday. So hold that. And then Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. This is the introduction to, this little mini narrative of Ruth. And this is where we see Naomi, and she has two boys. One of them marries this woman named Ruth. Naomi's husband dies. The two boys die. The one daughter-in-law goes back to her mom, and the other daughter-in-law, Ruth, says, "Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God." It's also worth noting that Naomi is an Israelite, one of the Hebrew people, and Ruth is not. Ruth, I think, is a Moabite, probably. That's where they are. So we got a lot going on, and then the story of Ruth later goes to the whole Boaz thing, covering feet. What does that mean? Scandal. And then we get this nice little button at the end of the book of Ruth where Ruth and Boaz have a kid named Obed. Obed has a kid named Jesse, and Jesse has a bunch of kids, one of them named David. So it's a nice
Yes.
setup to the story of David. But back to chapter 1, that text, Children's Sabbath, what are you making with these little pieces of a pie here for your sermon?
Well, I am really focused on Ruth's story and the way she sort of takes matters into her hands. Naomi is certainly the elder. We would consider her the wise one of the family, but she's certainly experiencing a lot of grief. Her husband has died. She's lost both her sons. Beyond the level of grief that we might imagine, this is also a tragedy in the ancient Near East because her livelihood, her ability to care for herself is all gone. Women are not allowed to own property. They're not allowed to work. So any means that she has of caring for herself and perhaps this or the other daughter-in-law are gone when her husband and her sons die. So she's basically as good as dead. And so we can understand why she would say to her daughter-in-law, "Why don't you just go? You've got a better chance back where you came from than staying with me," because she's kind of a dead woman walking. And so Ruth takes matters into her own hands and says, "If you're heading home, I'm heading with you, and I'm not going to let you go alone. You are my person, and your God is my God." And there's a way in which there's a certain leadership quality to what Ruth does. She's not going to let Naomi give up. She's not going to let her travel by herself. And when they do make it back to Bethlehem, house of bread, there's a famine that Ruth and Naomi are experiencing where they are. They head back to the house of bread, Bethlehem. And Ruth kind of runs things, kind of takes care and orchestrates and allows this God that is Naomi's God to guide the trajectory of their lives, which of course we know becomes connected to Jesse and eventually David and Jesus,
Oh
which
yeah,
is,
Jesus.
pretty amazing trajectory. So the tie for me for Children's Sabbath, I think, again, goes back to leadership and what we allow children to do and be in a community of faith. The sermon title is "Let Them Lead the Way." It comes out of a song of The Greatest Love that many of us know Whitney Houston sang.
Teach them well and let them lead the way.
but originally sung by George Benson. If you haven't heard his version, I encourage you to go back and listen to it.
I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way.
I love the George Benson version, but it says, I believe the children are the future, teach them well, and let them lead the way. So after getting back from the farm, I was really intrigued with this idea of children and youth leadership. They know things, they have ideas. We see Ruth, who is probably in her late teens, early 20s when she marries, and is not much older when she is leading the way. And I think that opens some interesting possibilities for our sermon preparation this week.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, both it gives us a lens of these characters in this narrative of Ruth, how the younger one would, isn't just following the leader blindly. She's joining and if anything supporting, saying where you go, I'll go, meaning I'm in this with you. I'm not going to let you just wither and die. I think what even in the text, Naomi says, change my name to Mara, which means bitter, because the Lord has, I came here full, but I'm returning home empty, and she's in this very difficult place. And for
Right.
Ruth to say, I'm going to stick with you, that's a unique role that a younger person is playing. And similarly, in churches, it's very common for us to just want to put the kids on a pedestal and be like, oh, look how cute they are. Sing for
Right.
us, kids. Do this little thing. Oh, look, you
Right.
read the big words from the Bible. Which, not that we shouldn't have kids singing and reading scripture, but if all we're doing is putting them up for display, we're not
Mhm.
actually inviting their voices and their leadership and their experiences and their wisdom to be a part of where God is leading us. So I love
Yes.
that little overlap that you've got cooking already. That's great.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited about it. I actually have been reviewing our church bylaws, and I know that one of the wonderful things that Riverside is rooted in is having a youth leader on each one of our commissions. I know, year in and year out, it's not the easiest thing to do, but the fact that that is built into our DNA and baked into the way we govern is very exciting, and definitely another invitation for us to let children lead the way. I will also share that we have a really special connection with the Dance Theater of Harlem, where I trained and studied and performed as a young dancer. The new artistic director was my choreographer when I was at DTH, and they will be coming to offer
Hmm.
a dance called The Greatest Love to the Whitney Houston version, not the George Benson. Um, but we'll have a pas de deux, a dance for two, following the sermon that day. We thought it would be a
Hmm.
really wonderful way to embody beauty and leadership for our children and youth and our entire community on
Yeah.
that day. And we're really excited to welcome the Dance Theater of Harlem to Riverside Church for the first time, I think, in worship. It's going to be a wonderful, I hope, start to an ongoing partnership
Hmm.
that just helps us to think about our bodies and how movement can also open us up to
Hmm.
God's good news.
And for a story like Ruth, embodying movement is essential because this story is all they're not staying still, which again
No,
is a good metaphor for children. They are rarely staying still. I have two tiny ones of my own, and if they're staying still, it means they're just watching an episode of Bluey for 7 minutes or so. But they are
right.
constantly in motion, and so how do we, even liturgically recognize that and embody that, and what will that say that even words sometimes are insufficient to do? Whew, this
Right.
is going to be good.
Yeah, I think it's probably going to be a short sermon this week because, like you said, I don't think we need a lot of words. And the other thing I'm excited about, we asked the children, we wanted their voices and their fingerprints all over everything in worship as a way, I think, just get us as a community thinking about children and youth input in the way we shape our lives together, including worship. So the sermon is really going to use their words. They've written them, they've recorded them, we're using them to write the liturgy, and I'm centering them in the sermon. So I will do a setup for their very powerful sermon and then a closing. And I think it'll be wonderful for our congregation to hear the words of the children out of their own mouths about what they need from their church and where they think the church should be focusing
Yeah.
in this moment in time.
What would you say to other preachers who look at these, intersections in the lectionary and then just in what's happening in the
Mm.
life of our community? Like narrative lectionary, children's Sabbath. Ruth is probably not the first thing you would have picked when you thought about preaching children's Sabbath Sunday. and you have such a playful, spirit that you're like, okay, let's see what happens with this little fun thing. But other preachers might be like paralyzed. How do I even engage? How would you just invite them into those potentially difficult intersections, and how would you invite them to have that kind of posture of play and possibility?
Right. It's such a good question. And I think part of the beauty of the Bible is there's so many ways in. Ruth is challenging and problematic because of the nature of her being a foreigner and this overlay that's not a lovely overlay of what it means to be a foreigner in the Bible, especially in the Hebrew Bible. Foreigners are maltreated, thought of as less than. Things are said to them and done to them that aren't really lifted up in the traditional interpretation. And so for women and people of color to go back and sort of rescue that in this day and age is a new thing. And I think when I preach Ruth generally, I'm leaning into sort of like societal ills, what it means for women to not be attached to a man. What are the financial implications that we see for Naomi and Ruth? How the goal of the story is to marry Boaz and to have a baby. All of those things can be hurtful for women who can't have babies, don't choose not to have children, don't want to be tied to a man. I mean, there's so much in this text that is patriarchal. So then children's Sabbath and Ruth was like, oh my God, what do I do? So I just started by, trying to find out as much about Ruth and her background as I could. It was helpful to know that she got married probably the age that Mary and Joseph were together, which is like mid-teens. Okay, that's interesting. She was a fairly young woman. And then her husband dies not much later than that. She doesn't marry Boaz. Some of the historical words say until she was in her 40s. But her life and her leadership starts at a fairly young age. And I think there's something in that. The fact that even as a younger woman, younger than her mother-in-law, that she takes matters into her own hands, I think is a interesting place to go when we're thinking about children. For me, I think especially with characters, it helps to just sit down with that character. Like, what was she like? What was her life like? How did she come to be married to this man who was not of her kin? What does that say to us about children who are different? You just start asking questions. I think someone was just saying the other day, I think it's Biggie Smalls, who's a rapper, was talking about this abundance of questioning. So you just start asking questions of the text, of the character, of the time period. And then I think of the people in your church. So for me, it was the children, it was the youth. I might have a conversation with Reverend Amanda, take it to our worship meeting and talk to the other clergy. This is what I'm thinking about doing. And then, we kick ideas around, and usually something comes out of that goes, that's the sermon.
I love that. I mean, even just that posture of, an abundance of questions. Whereas some people approach the Bible with, it's just like, this has all the answers. There's no room for questions, or the Bible just preaches itself. And you're always saying, no, the Bible is always spoken in a context. And that's the power of it. Is like, you can read the same story on different days and it all feels different because we're different people on those days. The world is different those days. And that openness to just see what is going to intersect. And then, like you said, not doing it alone, clergy team, our education minister, inviting the voices of children. There's lots of ways that this becomes more than just what's the great wisdom from Reverend Thorne this week, which is wisdom too. Let's not diminish that. But
well, yeah, but as educated as we are, we and other people, and as smart as we are and as creative as we are, we don't hold it all. And it's so important with these texts to be precious with them because, as one of my New Testament Bible scholars said, the text is like this. I think it was a Japanese fish, she said, that if it was not, and it was served raw, and the preparation, it could either be a delicacy or it could be deadly. I think it was a blowfish. And I think the Bible is similarly, depending on how you serve it up, it can be life-giving water, but it can also be deadly. And so we want to hold that with some exquisite care because of the way it's been used to harm so many people. And so yeah, I try to take that seriously and yeah, check in with people and say, this is what I'm thinking about. And they'll say, no, don't do that. Or, yeah, that's crazy. So you take your little bit of wisdom and other people's little bit of wisdom, and the Holy Spirit mixes that up, and hopefully you get something life-giving.
Yeah. Hopefully you get a delicacy, because there's
Hopefully.
far too many times when this book
Yeah.
has been turned into something
gosh.
deadly for far
Yes.
too many people.
Yes.
Yeah. Whew. Well, it's going to be another great Sunday. They always tend to be, it seems. I can't think of a time when we haven't had a great Sunday at Riverside. And this sounds like another fantastic sermon. I think people will be eager to see how all these spaces intersect for Children's Sabbath. So everyone watching, listening, join us Sunday. You can head over to the Upper West Side, West Harlem, right there in New York City, or just join us online, trcnyc.org, 11 a.m. Eastern Time on Sunday. You can see exactly what sort of delicacy gets made from all of these ingredients. And then we'll be back next week. I think we're into Samuel. So we're just jumping to a new character. So it's going to be, this narrative just keeps on going. So hold on tight. It's going to be fun. And we'll talk more about that one next week. Talk to you all then.